Welcome you all to the special interview on Sri Lanka and China relations. For that, we have here with us today Dr. Bhagya Senaratne, Senior Lecturer, Department of Strategic Studies, Faculty of Defense and Strategic Studies.
Dr. Bhagya Senaratne is currently in China as the postdoctoral fellow of Global Asia at New York University, Shanghai, China. She is the first academic from the Faculty of Defense and Strategic Studies and General Sir John Kuthalal Defense University to proceed on a postdoctoral fellowship. Dr. Senaratne is also the only female academic from the Department of Strategic Studies to hold on a doctorate. Her doctoral research was titled as an analysis of Sri Lanka-China bilateral relations from year 1994 to 2015.
Based on her credentials, it appears we selected the best possible person to speak about China-Sri Lanka relations. Ma'am, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today amid your busy schedule. Before we talk about contemporary relations, ma'am, I would like to ask you about the history of Sri Lanka's relations with China. Over to you, ma'am.
Of course, Sahana, lovely seeing you once again after a couple of months of absence. And like you rightly said, I'm based in China right now, so I guess it gives an added advantage to talk about bilateral relations between Sri Lanka and China. Now, you're asking me a very loaded question. You're asking me about the history, the basic overview of Sri Lanka's relations with China. So, Sahana, if you look at relations between the two countries, it spans many centuries, right? Just a couple of examples would be in the 5th century, we had a monk called Fa Xiang. I actually have some pictures which let me try and share them with you. So we have a monk called Fa Xiang who's visited. We've also had an admiral called Zheng He coming in from China. And if you look at this stone tablet, which I've captured from the Maritime Museum here in Shanghai, it is a replica of the very same stone tablet you will see in Gaul. It's a trilingual tablet depicting Admiral Zheng He's visits to Sri Lanka. And it talks of the politics, it talks of commercial activities. We also see, Sahana, based on a lot of historical records, not just Eastern records, but also records from Europe West, that there have been many commercial travels, trade relations, and we've also dispatched, Sri Lanka has also dispatched what we call embassies or delegations to China from time to time. We also have some history related alongside Zheng He's visits with the Kotte Kingdom in Sri Lanka. We speak of one of our kings being taken to China. And here, this map again from the China Maritime Museum would show you, it's in Chinese, but it shows Sri Lanka and the routes Zheng He took to navigate around the world. And as you can see, Gaul was a frequent stop for him, right? And these kind of things show us the early history between the two countries. After China stopped some of its maritime explorations going outwards into the sea, we don't really hear about exchanges between the two countries. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit into the 20th century, where we see diplomatic relations being established in 1957, right? So here you will see a well-known figure in Sri Lanka, SWRD Bandaranaike, alongside Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. And you'll probably recognize this gentleman as well, Jawaharlal Nehru. So here we see Zhou Enlai comes to Sri Lanka in 1957 in February to attend Sri Lanka's Independence Day. And a few days later, February 7th, he also attends the official signing of diplomatic relations between the two countries. The very same year, right? The very same year, we have Wilmot Pereira, who's pictured here, going to China as Sri Lanka's first ambassador to China, and he served the entire course in 1957. I also have to talk to you a little bit about bilateral relations. When you talk of because you want an overview, we can look at the people-to-people relations, right? People-to-people relations are very warm. We can look at tourism as an example. There's a lot of businesses taking place. And of course, with COVID, this has stopped. But pre-COVID, Chinese tourists were one of the largest inbound tourists to Sri Lanka. There's a lot of obviously cultural and educational links. China gives a lot of scholarships to Sri Lankans. And I'm not saying just the normal ordinary citizen like you and I, but also a lot of defense and security related scholarships, right? There's also been an increased activity around teaching Mandarin. So there's been a couple of Confucius centers coming up around Sri Lanka. We also see in terms of Buddhism, Buddhist diplomacy is something that the two countries are working on and promoting. So you can see across the board, and of course, defense and security, even during the conflict. I'm sure you have heard of this. China did provide a lot of assistance to Sri Lanka in terms of weapons, armaments, and ammunition. And of course, economics, which is like the hot topic. We do have a lot of interest. There's a lot of investment coming in, and of course, Chinese-driven development projects in Sri Lanka, from the Colombo port city to the Hambantota port. Some of our highways, most of our highways are Chinese-driven. We have the coal power plant. So that's kind of an overview, Sahana. But of course, I think if I don't mention this, it'll be wrong of me. That's the Maritime Silk Road or the Belt and Road Initiative. So that's also one of the biggest projects Sri Lanka has been part of. We've been a member of the Belt and Road Initiative since it commenced in 2013. One of the founding members of the Belt and Road Initiative, and we'll be hitting 10 years next year.
Yes, ma'am, that was a very factful answer, which has linked all the aspects. And well, ma'am, the Rubber-Rice Pact between the two countries is well known. Can you tell us more about this agreement?
Absolutely. I think I didn't mention about the Rubber-Rice Agreement in talking to you about it. Sahana, the Rubber-Rice Agreement is actually really important when we talk about bilateral relations between China and Sri Lanka. Incidentally, I do have a picture of the agreement being signed. You should see it at any moment. So the Rubber-Rice Agreement was signed in 4th October 1952. This was during Prime Minister Dudley Senanayaka's government, right? So what happens is, so a couple of things. This agreement is very unique. One, because it's the first agreement that was signed between China and a non-communist state, right? So China has only so far, by 1952, only so far signed agreements with fellow communist states. But by this time, Sri Lanka decided, because of mutual domestic factors, Sri Lanka was running short of rice due to its internal conditions, right? China, on the other hand, needed rubber because of the Korean War. And rubber was a strategic material which was banned to be sold in the international market. So due to the famine, Sri Lanka couldn't produce as much. And here was a conducive environment for the two countries to actually sign this agreement. So after months of negotiation, the two countries decided this is something mutually beneficial, and they signed it on the 4th of October 1952 to be renewed every 5 years, right? Now the catch here is that this agreement was very beneficial for Sri Lanka. One, because we got rice at a price that was lower than the market price, world market price, right? And we sold rubber at a price higher than the market price. Okay. So we ended up profiting from this agreement. And only 2 weeks after signing this agreement, we say this is the port of Shanghai. Immediately after signing the agreement, the Chinese government took measures to send the first shipment of rice to Sri Lanka, and it was loaded on the 20th of October, 1952, right? And another important thing, Sahana, that I need to mention is these shipments, right? Even though, say, for example, China was not in a position to provide rice, say, from their own internal stocks, they actually bought rice from other countries, maybe Thailand or wherever, and sold it to Sri Lanka because they wanted to respect the agreement they had with Sri Lanka. Okay, so that's also something important that we don't see. China purchases rice from other countries and selling to Sri Lanka because they want to honor the agreement.
Thank you, madam. Thanks for that insightful answer. Now we're moving on to the third question, that it is evident that Sri Lanka has maintained healthy relations with China. So, ma'am, could you please describe the different roles played by Sri Lankan leaders to maintain bilateral relationships between Sri Lanka and China in time to time?
Absolutely, Hera. That's a very, very important question. Something I actually do talk about in my PhD thesis, and which will be published hopefully by next year. Individual leaders, state leaders have a really important role to play because individual leaders actually structure relationships, right? It can be based on the individual upbringing. It can be based on the circumstances, based on their networks, and also their worldviews. They influence how we interact with states, okay? If you look at relations, say during the Bandaranaike's time, right, both SWRD Bandaranaike and Mrs. Sidmao Bandaranaike, you will notice that Sri Lanka had really vibrant relations. And this is how, for example, we were able to sign an agreement with China to have maintained diplomatic relations. But if you look at, for example, relations during Gerard Jayawardena's time, it wasn't as vibrant, but he still had visits, he still maintained contact. Likewise, if you have during President Chandrika Kumaratunga's time, she initiated business delegations to travel with her. And you would see that this is one of the prominent features during her tenure, where she had Chinese business delegates coming in and furthering business interactions with Sri Lankan investors. So you can see here during a time, so these are the late 20th century, early 21st century, when we were fighting the conflict, our people didn't have opportunities, right? So having President Kumaratunga initiating these business delegations assisted our people to have business-to-business contact or B2B contact, okay? So you can see the kind of twist she did. Now during, for example, President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, it was very different. He was in a situation in the world where he didn't have a lot of contacts. For example, there was pressure from the US, the UK about the conflict to stop the conflict, not militarily drive the conflict, right? And instead go for negotiations. But there were countries like India, there was China that actually helped, not just in terms of defense relations, but also in terms of investments and economic relations. So here we can see these individuals, how they interact with China, and that individual charisma, individual characteristics also help, right? And from President Mahinda Rajapaksa onwards, we also see a lot of interaction, state visits to China and vice versa. President Xi Jinping visited Sri Lanka in 2014, 35 years after any single state leader from China has come in, right? And of course, even though during President Sirisena's time, there were certain decisions to stop interactions, say like the Port City project, we still see he undertook several state visits to China, right? So these are important. Even right now, President Ranil Wickremesinghe is interacting with China. We are trying to restructure some of our debt. So we have these conversations taking place with China based on individual leaders.
Thank you, madam. It was much factful and quite a good answer, ma'am. Then for the fourth question, moving on to the current situations, contemporary situations between China and Sri Lanka, and as well as Sri Lanka's current crisis. So we are aware about the Sri Lanka is in very critical situation, and Sri Lanka has become one of the hot topics in the world. So, ma'am, what is China's reaction to Sri Lanka's contemporary situation, specifically according to the economic crisis, ma'am?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important question here, especially because from earlier this year, we've been talking of economic crises. We've been talking of, well, not just talking, we've all been experiencing it, I think. And from the power cuts to inflation, petrol queues, etc. So what we see here is since the default, the preemptive default in April 2022, there's been a lot of talk on one, debt restructuring. How are we going to come out of this situation? We also see that Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF to secure funding, secure a loan to see if there is a way to pay some of the debt, right? So Sri Lanka has said they are going to continue to pay multilateral loans, but not bilateral loans, and that bilateral loans will be restructured. So here you mentioned China. China is an important bilateral lender because we do have a lot of loans with China. China has lent a lot of loans to us. Two banks, especially China Exim Bank and the CDB, China Development Bank, have given us a lot of loans. And I think if we are going to restructure any loans, it would be with these two countries, with these two banks. And in restructuring, so far we see some hesitance. There hasn't been a lot of excitement from the Chinese end, right? I also draw your attention to this very recent publication, not by me, but by a lecturer from the University of Colombo, Umesh Moramudali, and his co-author Thilina Panduawala. They've done a comprehensive study of the economic situation, demystifying some of these myths, inaccuracies regard to China's interactions with Sri Lanka, right? But what you need to know is that of the loans we've got, of the situation, China has given us a considerable amount of loans even in the recent past, starting from COVID. But even this year, we saw $1 billion coming in. There was another 1.5 billion credit line. Unfortunately, I think the credit line didn't fall through because Sri Lanka went to IMF. If you also look at some of the statements from the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka, you would notice that the ambassador has said they are willing to engage in negotiations, but unfortunately, because Sri Lanka has already gone to the IMF, then there is nothing they can do but to see what the IMF result would be. Okay, so when you look at the Chinese and the statements have said that they do want to help Sri Lanka, right? But in practice, I think it's a little short of coming. There could be more assistance from the Chinese end, especially with regard to the restructuring of debt.
Well, okay, thank you, ma'am. Even though we would like to continue to talk to you, we will have to limit ourselves to one last question due to the time constraints. Ma'am, we would like to know about your thoughts, according to your point of view, What is the future of Sri Lanka's relations with China?
So this is a tricky question. Future relations with China, Sri Lanka's future relations with China, to be precise. Traditionally, in the past, Sri Lanka has had favorable relations with China, right? China has been very forthcoming and has assisted Sri Lanka multiple times. Like we see the spirit of the 1952 Rubber-Rice Agreement. We see time and time again, China coming to our rescue, be it in terms of development assistance, be it in terms of defense assistance, security assistance. So there is that spirit that China is helpful. Even in the 80s, the 70s, various negotiations, you would see the people who engaged in these negotiations telling us China doesn't bargain, right? Chinese delegates, diplomats are very forthcoming. They would easily give Sri Lanka whatever it asks. So if Sri Lanka says we want 10 billion, we want this amount of rice or this amount of XYZ, there was always that forthcoming nature to provide what Sri Lanka wanted. But you see China's relations, China's policies, tactics changing after the 20th century. Sorry, 21st, in the 21st century. We see China becoming somewhat more assertive. Chinese diplomats aren't exactly always exactly too forthcoming, right? There are a lot of changes taking place. And even now you see with this debt restructuring, there is some hesitance, right? So what we can see is that going forward, China would ask Sri Lanka certain favors, where Sri Lanka, I think, would be in a situation that we are unable to say no. And you have to remember that in the international system, it's about give and take, right? And right now, we've been taking a lot from China. There has been a lot that Sri Lanka has benefited from engaging with China. So in the future, I think we're already seeing it, right? Something I spoke about a couple of years back is that China would be asking us certain favors, certain agreements, and we will be in a tight position as to how to go about doing it. How do we also reciprocate this? Okay. And if at this rate, China does want to engage more thoroughly, more heavily with through the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's only time that Sri Lanka will have to decide what kind of role it wants to take. Are we talking about an on-the-line policy? Are we actually going to be taking independent decisions devoid of what is happening in the Indian Ocean region or the Indo-Pacific? We see there's a lot of commentary on those relations as well. So in the future, what we really need to understand is, one, what is our internal policy? Two, what are our foreign policy goals? What do we want to achieve as Sri Lanka? And three, based on those internal and foreign policy objectives, how are we going to engage with China? To what extent do we want to engage with China? Yeah. So I think that kind of wraps up an overview of Sri Lanka's relations with China. And I am extremely grateful for both Sahana and Herat for talking to me about this very crucial topic at a very important time. I don't think we could have spoken about it at a more opportune time than right now. So I wish you all the best. And take care.
Thank you for always sharing your professional knowledge and experience, madam. And let's wrap up the session. So we've asked continuous 5 questions along the Sri Lanka and China bilateral relations. Ma'am, it's like we want to thank you to regarding that you have used presentations in insightful presentations, and you have used the pictures according to the Sri Lankan and China relations. to evidently prove what are the mostly according facts are. And I hope that all of you can gain some insight about China and Sri Lanka relations by watching this video. So, ma'am, thanks again. Thank you very much for joining us today from China amidst your busy schedule, ma'am. And we'll conclude in the official video.